On the morning of October 14th, 1902, a man emerged from the pine forests north of Marquette, Michigan, walking slowly along the Chicago and Northwestern Railway tracks. His name was Samuel Gast. He was 28 years old, a surveyor by trade, originally from Brandenburg, Prussia, naturalized American. He had been missing for 41 days. He was alone. The crew that had gone in with him, 7 men, including his younger brother Johann, did not return. The Marquette County Sheriff's Office recorded his arrival at the station on 3rd Street at approximately 10:15 a.m. Deputy Marshal Eugene Fitzpatrick wrote in his incident log, "Subject appeared in fair physical condition, clothes torn but not severely, boots intact, no visible wounds, refused water initially, sat without speaking for approx. 20 minutes. When asked where the others were, Samuel looked at the deputy and said nothing. When asked what had happened in the woods, he said nothing. When asked if they were dead, he closed his eyes. The interrogation, if it can be called that, lasted less than an hour. Samuel Gast answered only factual questions: his name, his age, his residence in Negaunee. He confirmed he had been part of a surveying expedition contracted by the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company. He confirmed the names of the other men. He confirmed they had entered the forest on September 3rd. He would not confirm how they died. He would not confirm that they had died. He simply would not speak about it. By the afternoon, word had spread. The families gathered outside the sheriff's office, wives, mothers, a father with a cane who had to be held upright by his daughter. Mrs. Hollis Tennant, whose husband Albert had been the expedition's cook, was recorded as having shouted at Samuel through the window, "Tell me where he is. Just tell me where." Samuel, according to witnesses, turned his face toward the wall. Sheriff William Krabasa attempted a more private approach. He brought Samuel into a back room, offered him bread and coffee, and spoke to him as one might speak to a child waking from a nightmare. The sheriff's personal journal, donated to the Marquette County Historical Society in 1954, contains the only written account of this conversation. "I told him no man would be charged for surviving. I told him the Lord does not punish a man for living when others do not. I told him the families deserve to know. He looked at me as though I had asked him to cut his own throat. Then he said, and these were his only words on the matter, 'I can't.' Not I don't know. Not I don't remember. I can't." A search party was assembled within hours. 18 men, including 2 Ojibwe guides, entered the forest with coordinates Samuel had reluctantly provided on a map, coordinates marking the expedition's intended survey route. They found the camp on the 5th day. 3 canvas tents collapsed and shredded, equipment scattered, a fire pit cold and layered with weeks of rainfall. They found no bodies. They found no graves. They found no blood. What they did find: 7 bedrolls still laid out, 7 tin plates, as if awaiting a meal that never came, a surveying theodolite, overturned, Johann Gast's leather journal, water-damaged and illegible beyond the entry dated September 19th, which read only, "Wind changed direction. Sam says we should." The sentence ended there. One of the guides, a man named Peter Blackbird, later told a reporter from the Mining Journal that the camp felt wrong. He would not elaborate. The other guide, Joseph Kieschig, refused to speak to journalists entirely. Both men declined further involvement in the search. The party returned empty-handed after 9 days. The official report, filed by Sheriff Krabasa, concluded that the men had likely perished due to exposure, predation, or misadventure, and that the bodies had been scattered or consumed by wildlife. It was a tidy explanation. It satisfied no one, least of all the families. Samuel Gast was not charged with any crime. There was no evidence of foul play, no motive, no witnesses. But absence of evidence is not the same as innocence, and in a town like Marquette, small, tightly wound, built on iron and gossip, suspicion does not require proof. He was watched. His boarding house landlady, Mrs. Greta Voss, later recounted that he returned to his room, locked the door, and did not emerge for 3 days. She left meals outside. Most went untouched. She said she heard him pacing at night, back and forth, the floorboards creaking in rhythm. She said once she heard him speak aloud, just a few words in German, which she did not understand, but which sounded, she said, like a prayer or a plea. On the fourth day he came downstairs. He asked for his week's wages from the mining company, which had been held pending the investigation. He collected them without comment. He purchased a train ticket to Chicago. Before he left, he visited the Marquette County Courthouse and filed a single-page affidavit. It was a legal formality, a statement for the record. It contained no narrative, no explanation. It simply attested under oath that the other 7 members of the expedition were deceased, that he had witnessed their deaths, and that he would not, provide further testimony as to the circumstances. The clerk who notarized the document, a man named Thomas Emery, wrote in a letter to his sister. He signed his name with a steady hand, but his eyes were the eyes of a man who had not slept in a month. Samuel Gast left Marquette on October 22, 1902. He would live another 34 years. He would never return to Michigan, and he would never, to anyone's knowledge, speak of what happened in those woods. To understand the silence, one must first understand what was lost. The expedition was not remarkable. In the late summer of 1902, the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company, then one of the largest copper producers in the United States, commissioned a routine land survey in the forests northwest of Marquette. The goal was to assess timber resources and identify potential rail routes for future extraction. It was a small operation. 8 men, 6 weeks, decent pay. Samuel Gast was hired as lead surveyor. He had worked for Calumet and Hecla twice before, both times without incident. His reputation was solid, meticulous, quiet, competent. A company foreman's report from April 1901 described him as thorough and tireless, though not given to much talk. He recruited the crew himself. His brother Johann was the first. 24 years old, recently married, eager to earn enough to buy a plot of land near Ishpeming. Friends since childhood described Johann as Samuel's opposite. Loud, warm, quick to laugh. A letter from Johann to his wife Clara, written 2 weeks before departure, survives in a private family collection. He wrote, "Sam says the work will be easy. He says the woods are beautiful this time of year. He says I'll come home with enough to start building." The others: Albert Tennant, 41, the cook, a Civil War veteran, formerly of the 24th Michigan Infantry, a man known to hum while he worked. Hollis Wade, 36, a chainman, responsible for measuring distances with the surveyor's chain, father of 4. His oldest daughter later recalled that he carved small wooden animals for his children and left a different one under each of their pillows the night before he departed. George Lund, 29, a compassman, Swedish immigrant, unmarried, shared a boarding house with Samuel and was said to be his closest friend. A postcard Lund sent to his sister in Göteborg, dated August 30, 1902, read, "America is strange and good. I think I will stay." Nathaniel Cobb, 33, another chainman, formerly a schoolteacher in Negaunee, dismissed for drunkenness, trying to rebuild his life. His estranged wife later testified that he had been sober for 8 months and had written to her asking for reconciliation. She never wrote back. Isaiah Mercer, 52, the axeman. Black, originally from Tennessee, had worked in Michigan's lumber camps for over 20 years. A church deacon, known to carry a small Bible in his coat pocket. His pastor, Reverend Amos Harlan, later said, "Isaiah was the kind of man who made you believe in grace." Otto Brinker, 19, the junior assistant. A recent German immigrant, spoke limited English, hired at Samuel's recommendation. His mother, in a letter to the Marquette diocese, begged the church to pressure Samuel into revealing what became of her son. The request was denied. They departed Marquette by rail on the morning of September 3, 1902. Several witnesses saw them off. Johann's wife, Clara, stood on the platform, holding his hand through the window until the train began to move. Albert Tennant waved to his children. George Lund smoked a cigarette and grinned. Samuel Gast, according to Clara's later testimony, stood apart from the others, checking his instruments. She said she remembered thinking he looked distracted. When she asked him if everything was all right, he nodded and said, "It's just work." The train took them north to a logging depot near the Dead River. From there they hiked west into the forest, approximately 16 miles over 2 days. The plan was to establish a base camp, then conduct radiating surveys over the course of 4 to 5 weeks. The forest in question was dense, second-growth mixed pine and hardwood, interspersed with swamp and low hills. It was not remote by wilderness standards. Logging roads crisscrossed the area. Other camps operated within 10 miles. It was not a place where men vanished. And yet, the early days, as reconstructed from Johann's journal and from supply records, were uneventful. They made camp near a creek. The weather was clear. The work proceeded on schedule. Johann wrote brief entries, mostly practical. Measured North Ridge, 1,220 feet elevation. Found old blaze marks, maybe 10 years old. One entry, dated September 11th, described a communal evening. Albert made stew. Nathaniel told a joke I didn't understand, but everyone laughed. Otto asked Sam to teach him compass reading. Sam was patient. Another, dated September 15th, George shot a grouse. We ate well. Isaiah led us in a hymn after supper. Even Sam sang, though quietly. These men were not strangers. They worked together, ate together, slept within earshot of one another. They trusted Samuel. He had chosen them. This is important. There is a photograph. It survives in the archives of the Marquette County Historical Society, donated anonymously in 1931. It is undated, but the clothing and equipment suggest it was taken in early September 1902, likely in the days before departure. 8 men stand in 2 rows in front of a wooden supply shed. Samuel is in the back row, second from the left, arms crossed. His face is unsmiling but calm. Johann stands beside him, one hand on Samuel's shoulder. Albert Tennant is crouched in the front, holding a skillet. George Lund is mid-laugh. Otto Brinker looks at the camera with the nervousness of youth. They look ordinary. They look alive. No one saw them again after September 3rd. No travelers reported encountering them. No loggers heard their voices or saw their fires. For 41 days, they existed only in the silence of the forest. And then Samuel walked out, alone. Reconstructing the final days is an exercise in absence. Johann Gast's journal, recovered from the camp, offers fragments. The handwriting grows less steady after September 16th. The entries become shorter, less descriptive. On September 17th, rain all day, gear wet. Sam concerned about the instruments. September 18th, creek rising. May need to move camp. September 19th, wind changed direction. Sam says we should, and then nothing. The search party's report provides physical details but no clarity. The camp was found intact, structurally, but abandoned with a strange casualness. The tents had not been struck. They had simply been left. Their guy ropes loosened or snapped, allowing the canvas to collapse under the weight of rain and wind. Inside, personal items remained: a deck of cards, a harmonica, a shaving razor, a pair of spectacles, later identified as belonging to Nathaniel Cobb. One tent contained a half-written letter from Hollis Wade to his wife. It read, "Darling, the work is hard but honest. The woods are deeper than I imagined. Sometimes at night I think I hear..." The sentence ended mid-thought. The pen had been set down beside the paper. There was no indication of haste or panic. It was as if he had simply stopped writing and walked away. The fire pit contained the remains of a meal, charred bones, possibly rabbit or grouse, and the remnants of hardtack. The coals had been cold for weeks, but the arrangement suggested the fire had not been abandoned suddenly. Someone had banked it, placing stones over the embers in the methodical way one does when intending to return. The surveying equipment, theodolite, compass, chains, lay scattered within a 50-foot radius of the camp. Not thrown, not smashed, just set down, left. There were no signs of struggle, no broken branches, no scuffed earth, no torn fabric caught on thorns, no spent shell casings. Each man had been issued a rifle for protection against wolves or bear. All 7 rifles were found leaning against trees, still loaded. No animal tracks of unusual size or number. The guides, Peter Blackbird and Joseph Kieschig, provided the only testimony that hinted at something beyond the mechanical facts. Blackbird, interviewed by a journalist from the Detroit Free Press in November 1902, was hesitant. He said the forest felt like it was waiting. When pressed, he clarified, "Not waiting for us, waiting for something else." He refused to elaborate further, saying only that he and Kieschig had both felt it was time to leave. Kieschig, who spoke through an interpreter, was more direct. According to the interpreter's notes, Kieschig said the camp smelled wrong. Not of decay, there were no bodies, but of old smoke and cold water. He said the silence in that part of the forest was too deep. "Birds don't go there anymore," he said. When asked if he thought the men had died, Kieschig paused for a long time. Then he said, "I think they left." "Left where?" the interpreter asked. Kieschig shook his head. He would say no more. Sheriff Krabassa's search report, filed on November 3, 1902, acknowledged these testimonies, but dismissed them as products of superstition and the unsettling nature of the forest environment. He concluded, "It is the assessment of this office that the 7 missing men perished due to a combination of factors, including but not limited to sudden weather event, accidental drowning in the swollen creek, predation by wolves or bear, with subsequent dispersal of remains, or becoming lost and succumbing to exposure in the days following the suspected separation. The lack of bodies is unfortunate but not unprecedented in wilderness environments. The survivor, Mr. Samuel Gast, is believed to be suffering from acute psychological distress and is unable to provide coherent testimony. No criminal proceedings are recommended." The report was accepted. The case was closed, but the questions did not close with it, because there was one detail Sheriff Krabassa chose not to include in his official report, a detail that came to light only decades later when his personal journal was made public. On the 6th day of the search, one of the men, a volunteer named Thomas Harkness, found something approximately a quarter-mile west of the main camp. A circle, not a natural clearing. A circle of stones, each roughly the size of a man's head, arranged with too much precision to be accidental. Approximately 12 feet in diameter. In the center, the remains of a fire, much larger than the cook fire at the main camp. And around the fire, pressed into the soft earth, boot prints, 8 sets. Harkness called the others over. Blackbird examined the prints and confirmed. 8 men had stood here in a circle facing inward. The depth of the prints suggested they had stood for some time, minutes, maybe longer. Sheriff Krabassa ordered the site documented and then ordered the men not to speak of it. In his journal he wrote, "I do not know what to make of it. I do not know if it signifies anything. But if the families were to learn that the men had gathered in such a way that they had perhaps enacted some ritual or made some decision together, it would only deepen their grief and suspicion. Better to let them believe it was accident. Better to let them believe the forest took them quickly." The stone circle does not appear in any official record. Samuel Gast was never asked about it, but someone knew. Because in 1907, 5 years after the disappearance, an unsigned letter arrived at the Marquette County Courthouse, addressed to Sheriff Krabassa. It was postmarked from Chicago. The handwriting was careful, controlled. It read, "They made a choice. I was not part of it. I tried to stop them. I couldn't. Do not blame me for surviving what they chose." There was no signature. Krabassa, in a note appended to the letter, wrote, "I believe this to be from Samuel Gast. I have chosen not to pursue the matter." Samuel Gast arrived in Chicago in late October 1902 and disappeared into the city as thoroughly as 7 men had disappeared into the forest. He did not seek work as a surveyor again. Records from the Chicago City Directory show him employed beginning in 1903 as a draftsman for a printing firm on South Halsted Street, work that required precision and silence, 2 things he seemed to cultivate. He rented a small room in a boarding house on West 14th Street. He kept no known companions. The landlady of that boarding house, a widow named Mrs. Ida Kowalski, was interviewed in 1936, shortly before her death. She remembered Samuel clearly, though he had left her house in 1908. "He was the quietest tenant I ever had," she said. "Paid on time, never complained, never caused trouble. But he had nightmares. I could hear him through the walls, not screaming, worse than that, crying. A grown man, crying like a child, 2 or 3 times a week. I asked him once if he needed a doctor. He said no. He said it would pass. It never did." She also recalled that he received almost no mail, with one exception. Every year, on the anniversary of his return, October 14th, he received a letter, always from Michigan, always from a different sender. She didn't know the contents, but she said he would read them standing by the window, his hands shaking, and then he would burn them in the stove. I asked him once what they said. He looked at me and said, "They want me to remember." I said, "Remember what?" He said, "That I should have stayed." The letters were from the families. Clara Gast, Johann's widow, confirmed in a 1920 interview with a researcher from the University of Michigan that she had written to Samuel every year for 18 years. She said the letters were not accusatory, at least not at first. "I only wanted to know what happened to Johann," she said. "I wanted to know if he suffered. I wanted to know if he called for me. I thought Samuel owed me that." She said she never received a reply. Not once. But in 1914, 12 years after Johann's disappearance, she received a package. Inside, Johann's wedding ring, which he had been wearing when he left. No note. Postmarked from Chicago. "I don't know how Samuel had it," she said. "I don't know what it means that he kept it all those years and then sent it back. I don't know if it was an apology or a confession or just an ending." She said she stopped writing after that. Others were less forgiving. Albert Tennant's widow, Margaret, became a vocal advocate for what she called the truth of the forest. She gave interviews to newspapers, wrote letters to state legislators, and even petitioned the governor of Michigan to reopen the investigation. She argued that Samuel's silence was itself evidence of guilt, that an innocent man would speak, if only to defend himself. In an interview with the Detroit News in 1909, she said, "He knows what happened. He knows where my husband is. He knows why 7 men died, and he lived, and he will not say. That is not the behavior of a man who stumbled upon tragedy. That is the behavior of a man who caused it, or who allowed it." Her campaign gained limited traction. A state representative from Marquette briefly considered sponsoring a bill to compel testimony in cases of mass disappearance, but the effort died in committee. Margaret Tennant died in 1918, reportedly still believing Samuel Gast was a murderer. The pressure was not only public. In 1911, Samuel was approached by a private investigator named Lawrence Decker, hired by the families of George Lund and Nathaniel Cobb. Decker tracked Samuel to his boarding house and waited outside for 3 days before Samuel agreed to speak with him. The conversation, as recorded in Decker's case file, lasted less than 10 minutes. Decker asked Samuel to describe the events of September 1902. Samuel said, "I can't." Decker asked if the men were murdered. Samuel said, "No." Decker asked if Samuel had killed them. Samuel said, "No." Decker asked if Samuel had witnessed their deaths. Samuel closed his eyes and said, "Yes." Decker asked how they died. Samuel stood up and walked to the door. Before opening it, he turned and said, "If I told you, you would not believe me. And if you did believe me, you would wish you hadn't." Decker wrote in his report, "Subject is either profoundly traumatized or profoundly deceptive. I cannot determine which. I do not recommend further pursuit. There is nothing more to be gained." Samuel moved twice more, once in 1908 to a smaller room on Ashland Avenue, and again in 1915 to a tenement near the stockyards. Each time he brought almost nothing. A single trunk, a few books, a framed photograph he kept face down on his dresser. A neighbor in the Ashland Avenue building, a man named Frank Dulac, later recalled seeing the photograph once when Samuel's door was ajar. "It was a group picture," Dulac said. "Men standing together, maybe 8 or 9 of them. I asked him who they were. He didn't answer. He just turned the frame back over and closed the door. By the 1920s, the story had faded from public memory. The families aged. Some moved away. The forest where it had happened was logged, cleared, replanted. The stone circle, if it had ever truly existed, was lost beneath new growth. Samuel Gast worked. He paid his rent. He walked to and from the printing firm each day with his head down and his hands in his pockets. He was, by all accounts, invisible, except once. In 1923, a young reporter for the Chicago Tribune named Ellen Moss was researching a feature on unsolved disappearances in the Great Lakes region. She came across the Marquette case and tracked Samuel down. She found him at a diner near his work, eating lunch alone. She introduced herself, explained her interest, and asked, politely she later said, if he would be willing to speak about the expedition, even briefly. Samuel set down his fork. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, I have spent 20 years trying to forget. You are asking me to remember. Why would I do that? Moss, in her notes, recorded what she said next. Because the families deserve to know. Samuel's response, the families deserve peace. The truth would not give them that. Moss pressed, how do you know? Samuel stood, placed $1 on the table and said, because I live with it every day, and I would not wish it on anyone. He left. Moss did not pursue the story further. In a letter to a colleague, she wrote, whatever happened to that man in those woods, it broke something in him that cannot be mended. I do not think he is lying. I think he is protecting us. Samuel Gast died on February 8, 1936, in his room on South Racine Avenue. He was 62 years old. The cause of death was recorded as heart failure. He was found by his landlord, Mr. Emil Hruska, who had entered the room after noticing that Samuel had not collected his mail for several days. Hruska later told police that the room was almost empty. A bed, a chair, a small table. No photographs, no personal effects, except one item. On the table, next to a cold cup of coffee, a folded piece of paper, handwritten, unsigned. It read, I am sorry I could not tell you. I am sorry I came back. I am sorry they did not. The note was filed with the death certificate and later destroyed in a records purge. Hruska, interviewed by a Chicago historian in 1952, said he remembered one other detail. There was a small wooden box under his bed. I opened it. Inside were 7 stones. Just stones. Smooth river stones. I thought it was strange. I threw them away. In 1958, the Marquette County Historical Society received a donation from the estate of Clara Gast, widow of Johann. She had died the previous year at the age of 81. Among the donated materials, Johann's letters, family photographs, and a single journal entry, not from Johann but from Clara herself, dated October 14, 1932. She wrote, today is the 30th anniversary of the day Samuel returned. I do not write to him anymore. I do not think of him with anger as I once did. I think of him with pity. I have come to believe that whatever happened in those woods, Samuel was not the cause, but perhaps he was the witness. And perhaps what he witnessed was so terrible, so unthinkable, that to speak of it would be to relive it. And so he chose silence. I have also come to believe that the silence was not for his protection, but for ours. If 7 men can vanish from the earth without a trace, if a forest can swallow them whole and leave only one behind, then the world is not what we believe it to be. It is not safe. It is not knowable. And perhaps Samuel understood that to tell us the truth would be to rob us of the only comfort we have left, the lie that we understand how people die. I hope he has found peace. I do not think he has. The historian's task is to reconstruct, to gather testimony, to weigh evidence, to build a narrative from fragments. But some narratives resist reconstruction. Samuel Gast's silence was not passive. It was deliberate. It was chosen. And it was maintained without exception for 34 years, through suspicion, through grief, through anger, through pleading. He could have spoken. He could have lied. He could have invented a story that would have satisfied the families, closed the case, allowed him to live without the weight of accusation. He did not. This suggests the truth was worse than suspicion, worse than blame, worse even than the guilt of survival. What happened in the forest northwest of Marquette in September 1902? We know 8 men entered. We know 1 returned. We know the forest kept no bodies, left no blood, offered no answers. We know the survivor lived the rest of his life as a man haunted not by what he had done, but by what he had seen. There are theories, of course. Murder. But there was no evidence, no motive, and Samuel's behavior suggests not guilt, but trauma. Accident. But 7 men do not die simultaneously by accident, and their belongings would not be left so carefully arranged. Suicide pact. But why would Samuel survive, and why would he describe it as something he could not speak of, rather than something he would not? Madness. A shared delusion, perhaps folie à plusieurs. But the journals show no indication of psychological break, and Samuel himself remained lucid for the rest of his life. Starvation, exposure, disease, but the timeline was too short, the camp too well supplied, and the bodies too thoroughly absent. Or perhaps the answer is simpler and darker. Perhaps something happened that Samuel could not explain without sounding insane. Perhaps he witnessed something that defied his understanding of the world, not supernatural but unnatural. A convergence of circumstance and human frailty, and the vast indifference of the wilderness that resulted in a horror too specific to name. Perhaps the men made a choice, individually or collectively, that Samuel could not prevent and could not participate in. Perhaps he was spared, or perhaps he fled, or perhaps he was simply the one who could not bring himself to follow. And perhaps he spent the rest of his life knowing that to speak of it would be to implicate not just himself, but the dead, to expose them to a judgment they could no longer defend against. Perhaps his silence was the only mercy he could offer them. In the end, we are left with this. 7 men entered a forest and did not return. 1 man returned and would not speak. The forest offered no explanation. The silence endures, and perhaps that is the answer. Not what happened, but that we will never know. Not because the truth was lost, but because it was kept by a man who understood that some things, once spoken, cannot be unheard, that some truths do not bring comfort, that some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. Samuel Gast carried his silence to the grave. The 7 men he left behind remain, in some sense, lost in the forest still, not as bodies but as questions. And we, the living, are left to wonder, what did he see? What did he survive? And why, in all those years, in all that silence, did he never once say, "I don't know"? Because he did know, and that perhaps is the most disturbing answer of all.